Moving right along with the next session. Good morning, everybody. I'm David Clement. I'm Executive Director of the Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions. That's presenter of this program. As a retired journalist, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next panel, which focuses on climate change and the media, of which I used to be a part. And please allow me also to take a moment, speaking of the media, to thank our media partners who helped publicize this event, WEDU and the Tampa Bay Times. May we thank the media co-sponsors. Well, the media are all over the weather when there's a hurricane coming down, bearing down on us, or a tornado wipes out a town, or the north is buried in blizzards. But is climate change news when there's no imminent crisis like that? What is the media's role in reporting climate change developments? This panel will explore those questions. But before I introduce the moderator, there is something that I have long wanted to say. Breaking news! I just learned a few days ago that there is an effort underway in this community, in this region, to create a news media collaborative on climate change for the Tampa Bay media. It would be similar to an existing consortium in South Florida for sharing of news about climate change. In South Florida, that consortium consists of the Miami Herald, Palm Beach Post, Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel, and WLRN-TV. They have formed what they call the Invading Sea Media Collaborative to share information on climate change, which, as we all know in South Florida, is far more advanced than it is here with flooding. The Tampa Bay media looks to form a similar consortium. Now, it's too early to talk about specifics or membership. It's still in the talking stages. But hopefully, it would include the local print media, of course, broadcast media, and maybe internet media, and hopefully maybe the Poynter Institute, which is based here in St. Pete. Now, why is this important? Well, one, it creates a larger critical mass for coverage of climate change. It likely would involve sharing of coverage and resources, which would assure that more information reaches more people. And second, it's an indication that the media get it, that they recognize that this is a genuine, ongoing condition that merits significant news coverage. Basically, that they're taking it seriously. It's more hopeful news on the climate change front. Now, with that prelude, let me introduce the moderator of this session. He is someone who should be very familiar to everyone here who keeps up on current events. That's because that's what he does. Ernest Hooper is East Hillsborough Bureau Chief, Assistant Sports Editor, and columnist for the Tampa Bay Times. His weekly column highlights issues and events at the local level and always contains a nugget of wisdom and closes with the line, "That's all I'm saying," which is also the name of the show he hosts on WEDU. Please welcome Mr. Ernest Hooper.
Hey, good morning. How are you guys?
Morning.
That was exciting breaking news, David. Let me just let you guys know that collaborative will function best if the other entities do all the work and the Times just publishes it. That's the plan, Jessica, so get cracking. So yeah, it is my great pleasure to be with you this morning, and I am real thrilled about the news. Allow me, if you will, 15 seconds of self-promotion. I will be taping the next episode of That's All I'm Saying later this month. It will air on May 9th, Thursday at 8:30 p.m., and it will be about sea level rise. And we will open the show if all goes as planned, with an interview with Congresswoman Kathy Castor. So I'm really excited about that. So without further ado, let's get started with our panel. Joining us this morning are three very esteemed journalists. First, to my immediate left, we have from WUSF Public Media. She is the environmental reporter and the host of Morning Edition, Jessica Meszaros. Jessica, welcome.
Thank you.
Also joining us all the way up from the 305, as we like to say, Chief Meteorologist for WTVJ, NBC Channel 6, John Morales. John, thank you for being here this morning. And finally, my colleague, he covers the environment for the Tampa Bay Times. He's also the author of the book, Old Florida. How about a warm welcome for Craig Pittman? So we're going to ask each of our panelists to kind of speak on this topic about covering climate change and what's happening in our environment. We'll give them each 5 minutes to kind of to share their perspective. We have a unique panel, one from print, one from radio, and one from television. I'd like to start, I thought we'd start with Craig. Craig, why don't you kind of open up and share with us your perspective on what it's been like covering climate change.
Thanks for putting me on the spot, man.
Yes, it's my job.
I've been covering environmental issues for the Times since 1998 and did not write my first climate change story until 2008, so that's my bad. But I really like the title of this session because that's sort of one of the problems of covering climate change, which is it's not an event. It's not something you can go out and sit through like this and then write about. It is something that's going on all the time, and you have to find ways to work it into your coverage or find reasons to write about it. And the other problem with covering climate change, I found, is that it's not just one thing. It's a lot of different things. It's sea level rise. It's ocean acidification. It's changing seasons. It's the march of mangroves up the Atlantic coast of Florida as they take over areas that used to be freshwater marshes. And how do you approach that? How do you try and wrap your arms around all of that at once? And so that's been sort of the struggle. The first story that I wrote in 2008, I did with another reporter. At the time, we had the luxury of a science reporter. So he and I together tackled this subject and wrote what seemed to us the most obvious story of all, which is sea level rise is already happening, and here's where you can see the effects in Florida. And the places we found were places that were generally natural areas. There were no seawalls to keep the sea back. They were places where you could already see that palm trees were toppling into the ocean because the water had come in far enough to undermine them, things like that. And we talked to scientists who said, yes, these are clear signs of what's going on. We've been watching this happen for a while, and now you can actually see the physical changes happening to the coast. And of course, we were deluged with letters and emails from people saying, you're part of a horrible agenda, you people stink, you've been suckered, all those scientists are on the pad. And that has not changed. Every time I write about climate change, I get those kind of letters and emails from people saying, basically, you're wrong. And it doesn't matter how much evidence you show me, I'm not going to believe you. So that's sort of the third problem with writing about climate change. I don't have any other topics I write about that get that level of angry, caps lock angry response from readers. And one guy in particular, I finally had to tell him this week, I said, look, Albert, every time I write about this, you write to me and you cite these same people who, it's people who work for the Heartland Institute, or some guy who is not a climate change scientist, who's like in some other field, and I send you back all the evidence otherwise, and you ignore it. So I'm not going to correspond with you anymore. And you're wasting my time. I have other things to do. And of course, I got back the email. So you're scared then. So, The good thing about, if you can call it that, the good thing about covering climate change in Florida is you can see it here already, and it's happening. And so there are ways to write about that. For instance, I did a story about problems that the Kennedy Space Center was having with sea level rise encroaching on areas that they need for the various activities they do there, and how they were having to deal with that, and how that was becoming a problem not just there, but at military installations all around the state. So if you can find a way to get into the story, then that's a way to do it. I would love to write about ocean acidification, but the problem with writing about ocean acidification is, how do you make that relatable to people's lives? If they're not already seeing it, they'll think it's just some abstract concept that doesn't affect them. And so you've got to find some way to take these large scientific issues and these very abstruse scientific studies and put them in a language that people can understand, where they can say, oh, now I understand, now I can see how it's affecting me. The other problem, and this is sort of a problem with any environmental issue, but in particular with climate change, is this environmental beat that I cover, it exists at a very uneasy intersection between science, the law, and politics. Science loves gray areas. Science loves discovering that maybe things are not as definite as they thought, because then it gives them something else to study. The law requires certainty. The law needs everything to be in black and white. And then politicians, I have noticed, tend to love anecdotes. They like to use an anecdote as a justification for changing the law or defending the law. And maybe that anecdote doesn't necessarily match up with what the science says, but that's okay, because it's a great story. And that I've run into that over and over in covering climate change. So the things that I have had to do involve getting acquainted with a lot of scientists, figuring out how to translate their language into language that people can understand, and looking for ways to write about climate change that are not necessarily tied to events, but there is some sort of a news hook that makes it timely and makes it something people will want to read.
All right, thanks, Craig. I think I want to bridge now to Jessica, and I think Craig touched on one of the points that I wanted to talk about was, how do you break this down, these lofty terms, if you will, so that people can relate to it. Sometimes when we talk climate change, we're talking about something that's projected to happen 20, 30, 40 years from now. What's your approach, Jessica, in reporting on this issue and making it relatable to your listeners?
Well, I think that NPR as a whole does a really great job of covering climate change from an international perspective down to, so a global perspective, down to local here for WUSF Public Media. And to the question of, is climate change news if it's not a hurricane? I mean, yes, definitely, absolutely, because when there is a hurricane, for public radio, it's all about public safety. It's all about, getting the information to the listeners, what shelters are open to you, where is there flooding happening, where is the storm right now. For Hurricane Irma, I was actually in my station for the eye wall of Irma was coming over us while I was live on the air, letting people know what's going on. A few days later, people were wrote to us when they got their Wi-Fi and their power back and saying, like, thanks, you guys were the voice on the air for us. You let us know what was going on. So that's the immediate danger is what we really focus on when we're talking about a hurricane. Everything else in between, between every major weather event is the time to talk about climate change, at least in my perspective. And some examples I'd kind of like to give on just this week, actually the last couple weeks on NPR, we've covered climate change extensively on so many programs. And so I don't know if you guys know that the BBC NewsHour is on from 9 a.m., starting at 9 a.m. every weekday. And now on Wednesdays, they're starting to do climate change, focused on climate change. And just this past Wednesday, they were talking about Canada's Antarctic region warming faster than the rest of the world. And what does that mean? What does that look like? It's warming more than it will warm more than double the global rate. And they're saying that, human factors dominated the reasons for warming. And so what does that mean? So we're looking at Canada, where is this most evident? And what does that mean for Florida? I think it makes people think about, it gives us an example of what's going on in the rest of the world. And then bringing it down to national, NPR's Lulu Garcia Navarro, who's a host on the weekends for NPR, she's from Washington, came to Florida to talk to people living in Florida, living in Miami, who are directly affected. And one of the biggest ones is, how is the heat affecting people's health? So I think that's kind of, so it's like, so as the same way that we're talking about immediate danger of a hurricane, what's the immediate danger of warming? So people who are working out in the streets, you know, she spoke with somebody who sells fruit in the streets and has lived in Florida for decades, and it's just like, it's getting so much hotter and hotter and hotter, and people can feel that anecdotally, but also talking to doctors who, they actually formed a coalition at FIU, Florida International University, to talk about the health effects that people are seeing. We're having longer allergy seasons, the air quality problems leading to respiratory issues, mosquito-borne illnesses, and also people are getting angrier. So the hotter that it is, people get more angry, and it leads to more violence. So that's kind of how it talked about on a national level, and then statewide. We were talking. You know, I think it's really important to talk to lawmakers. What are lawmakers? We're in the legislative session right now. What are lawmakers saying or doing and talking about climate change? There's one senator, Jose Javier Rodriguez, a Democrat from Miami, who's known to show up to the Capitol wearing galoshes with like #ActionClimateFL on the sides, and he has filed 5 climate change related bills. So relating that information to the listeners, what is going on, what's being talked about in Tallahassee, and then locally we actually had Ashley Listenby, one of our reporters. She talked about the Brookings Institution in January released, they ranked metro areas in the U.S. that would see higher climate-related costs between 2080 and 2099. The Tampa, St. Pete, and Clearwater region ranked second on that list. So that's 2080. We're talking about the future, 2080 to 2099. This local area. So I think that NPR as a whole does a really great job of talking about, from a global perspective down to locally, what's going on with climate change and how that affects people now and how it will affect them later.
All right, thank you, Jessica. All right, now we have John. And John, I understand you have a video that you want to show first. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're going to see?
Sure, and good morning, everyone. You were talking about how you've been talking to scientists and trying to translate their lingo into something layman terms that everybody can understand. And one of the biggest issues that we have is that scientists have a really difficult time communicating their findings, communicating their projections towards the future. And so there's a big disconnect between the climate scientists, or for that matter, the scientific community in general, and the general public. But broadcast meteorologists are really the most relatable scientists that you all see every day. And you might be familiar with other scientists, Neil deGrasse Tyson, for example, comes to mind. But as far as people that you see every day, and that perhaps after seeing them for a while and realizing that we're not always wrong with our weather forecasts, you begin to trust, or you've trusted because they've helped you through a hurricane, then we become an excellent pipeline for bringing science information to our audience in understandable terms. And we take that very seriously. So does the American Meteorological Society. So they see us as the station scientist. In that newsroom, nobody knows science better than the meteorologist does. So along those lines, we definitely want to communicate the state of the science of climate change. After all, we're asked to talk about not just meteorology, but meteor showers and supermoons, and if there's some kind of aircraft mishap, was weather related to it? We're involved in all those matters. Well, then it's also our responsibility to communicate on the state of the science of climate change. So that's my introduction to this video. Let's take a look, and then we'll comment more about it right afterwards.
So today is the official first day of summer. It's called the summer solstice.
And today has extra meaning for you, right, and meteorologist, because of this logo here behind us. Tell us about that.
Very cool.
Well, I tell you, today our profession is uniting. Meteorologists are uniting all around the world. You may have seen the hashtag #MetUnite and this logo with it. And here's what it means. The campaign is called Meteorologists United on Climate Change. Nearly 100 meteorologists across the globe are wearing this logo today in an effort to raise awareness regarding climate change. These images you see are from Spain, Canada, Belgium, Italy, and here in the United States. The logo was created in England, shows the warming colors representing the warming of the planet since 1850. From colder than normal temperatures to warmer than normal temperatures, we are plus 2.4 degrees since 1850 to the present day and age. And I'm wearing my cufflinks here, as you can see, that show the warming. Of course, I've got the cufflink upside down, but you understand.
No, it looks great.
We've gone from the colder temperatures in 1850 to the warming temperatures of today. So today, of course, is the first day of summer. It means hotter temperatures for everybody here in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, for many, climate change is a political issue, but should it be? More than 98% of those who study climate around the world agree that the planet is indeed warming and that warming is driven by man's actions. That view is rejected by many conservatives here in the United States, but Congressman Carlos Curbelo, a Republican, is helping lead a group that is embracing the science.
So we know it's real. We know that South Florida is the tip of the spear. Sea level rise is a major threat to our future here in this area. And what we're trying to do in Congress is depoliticize the issue. Today we have 31 Republican members on the record saying this is important, we need to play a role in fixing it, and they have come together with 31 Democrats to form the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. So we've made great progress, but the truth is we have a long way to go.
And folks, we will continue to enhance the message that we need to act on climate. Climate change is real, it's us, and it's serious. So now this is kind of a long format example of something I do with actually great frequency. Many opportunities arise when you're providing a daily weather forecast and there have been some extreme events going on maybe in your local market, TV market, or maybe elsewhere, that are the type of events that are consistent with what you would expect in a warming world. We could be talking about heat waves. We could be talking about extreme precipitation events, like some of these recent hurricanes, Florence and Harvey, and all the record rainfall that they produced. And whenever these things happen, especially if they happen in the local market, I'm not telling people it's being caused by climate change. I'm telling them it's consistent with what you would expect with a warming world, and you might expect more of this in the future. I don't get any pushback, by the way, and I've been doing this for many, many years, more than you have, as far as communicating climate change.
People like you more than they like Craig. That's what it is.
Plus, you got the snazzy cufflinks.
Yeah, yep.
But again, I take that job very seriously. You know, I've been in this business for a long time. I started with NOAA and the National Weather Service, and then after 7 years as a civil servant, I transitioned into media, broadcasted in Spanish for 18 years before doing what I do now for the last 10 years as chief meteorologist for the NBC-owned station in Miami. But I knew, you know, I saw James Hansen in the mid and late 1980s testify in front of Congress. And this was the first time that climate change was put on the radar of Americans, I think, for the most part, even though the science had been there. As a meteorologist, even though I'm not a climate scientist, I had a chance to understand the peer-reviewed papers that were out there. So I understood the science, but what really inspired me to start doing what I do in regards to climate change communications was when 100 meteorologists were brought to the White House in 1997 during the Clinton administration. And we saw Vice President Gore do his presentation there in the East Room of the White House. And the idea was we want to put this firmly on the radar of the broadcast meteorologists because that administration understood that we were the liaison to the general public in terms of communicating science. And ever since then, I've been doing more and more of it. And I'm proud to say that Climate Central says that I'm amongst the first 16 broadcast meteorologists in this country to start doing this. And there's over 2,000 of us out there. And again, the pushback is very minimal. And we can discuss more about that in just a bit. But that's what I do, and I plan to do more of it going forward.
All right, round of applause for everybody. Really appreciate that. Let me ask, you know, the topic is climate change news if it's not a hurricane. When are you, Jessica, you were mentioned reporting on a hurricane, but typically after the hurricane passes and after we have, you know, delivered that timely information, we begin to talk about cause, and a lot of times climate change comes up. Is there a risk involved in bringing up climate change in the wake of these hurricanes, these catastrophic floods, because your audience may be more interested in hearing about recovery and what's FEMA doing and other aspects of our drive to recover from the disaster?
I think that there's room for both. I think that it's really important to cover recovery efforts. You know, I only had a little bit of gas and slept under my desk for 6 nights and, you know, didn't want to drive home and check if I had power so that I could go out and see what was going on. You know, Everglades City had storm surge and was completely wiped out, and made sure to get out there. But I think it is important to talk about the causes as well, or, you know, talking to experts who are analyzing this. And I don't think that it's necessarily risky. I think that it's important to talk about both if that's what the case is, if that's what experts are saying. It's my job, you know, to make sure that we get all of the information out there for our listeners.
Mm-hmm. Craig, do you write about it? And when you write about it, do you use the term climate change? It's such a, you know, it's kind of a term that's become divisive, right or wrong. And even the name of this conference is Sea Level Rise Up. It's not climate change. Do you worry, as a wordsmith, do you worry about that particular phrase in addressing these issues?
No, because I think you have to be honest and factual with your readers, and climate change is a fact. I mean, there is really no scientific pushback against it to say it's not happening, it's not humans. I mean, sort of to me, the most convincing thing is there is a letter, and you can go on the NOAA website and find it, signed by the heads of the scientific academies of 13 nations saying climate change is real, humans are causing it. You know, if that's a Chinese hoax, that's the most convincing one ever. So yes, I use the phrase climate change, and I try to find ways to put it in the paper in context that people can understand and relate to. For instance, although sometimes I get a weird pushback from that. For instance, during the long red tide algae bloom that we had recently, I did several stories talking about here are possible reasons why this one is lasting so very long. And so I mentioned dust from the Sahara blowing across the Atlantic. I mentioned, obviously, pollution from leaky septic tanks and sewer lines here on land. And then I did a story about, that I mentioned, that climate change was an element of it. That specifically the National Climate Assessment from 2014 had actually predicted that we would see more harmful algae blooms as a result of climate change. And of course, with that story, as with all the others except for the septic tanks ones, I got bombarded with people saying, why are you letting the big polluters off the hook? It's all their fault. And so, you know, people were not open necessarily to hearing that climate change could have that effect in that way on their lives, that it could help boost these harmful algae blooms that were not just bad for the environment, but also bad for Florida's tourist economy. So even when you are factual, you have to be prepared for people saying, we reject that, we don't think it's true. As long as you're being striving for accuracy, I think you're going to have to keep calling it what it is and let the chips fall where they may. You mentioned about politically divisive. It's been interesting in the years that I've been covering it, seeing the changes in the politics. When Charlie Crist became governor, he made it really clear he was going to focus on climate change. He actually mentioned it in his inaugural speech, which caught a lot of people off guard. He held a big 3-day conference in Miami and invited Governor Schwarzenegger to come speak. They signed these compacts that the state was going to do this and this and this. He signed executive orders, and then he was succeeded by Governor Scott, whose attitude at first was, I don't believe it. And then when he got some flack for that, his fallback was, well, I'm not a scientist, and I want to hear about solutions. And so scientists actually went and met with him to explain to him, yes, science says this is real. And he again said, well, I'm all about solutions. So they sent him solutions and nothing happened. And now we have a governor who still won't say that he thinks climate change is real, but he's willing to listen to people telling him about things to do to counteract it, and he's on board for doing that. So it's that's where we are now as a state. Is we spent 8 years denying climate change was real, and now we're trying to play catch up on it. And so those are some of the stories that we're having to write about.
Mm-hmm. John, how do you walk that line between reporting the facts, helping people understand the science, and then really advocating about this issue to the point where you're challenging some of the things Craig has mentioned, some of the political perspectives that are counter to climate change?
Well, it is difficult, and I'll tell you why. I work in a newsroom. I work in broadcast news. I'm not supposed to editorialize in any way, shape, or form. But like Craig said a little while ago, when you're talking about, yes, science, but that spills into policy, and therefore, because it spills into policy, it tangentially rubs up, or maybe even more directly, against politics, then it's very difficult for me not to somehow dip my toes into that realm as well. And what that generally leads to is a bunch of hand slaps that I get in the newsroom. Maybe not so much for doing it on air. I mean, what you saw, I think, was very tame. And by the way, Carlos Cabrillo was voted out. He was voted out because all his other votes certainly were not in line with what you would have expected from a guy covering himself in the cape of Climate Crusader. So he's no longer there in Congress, although the Climate Caucus is still growing. But when you see my social media posts, and if some of you might follow me, if you don't, at John Morales NBC6, and that's on all platforms, you'll notice that I'm much more outspoken, standing up in defense of the environment, standing up for action on climate, and these days just standing up in defense of science. I mean, science seems to be under attack in this country, if not in all around the world. I'm not, at my age, going to, shut up and dribble.
So,
yeah.
So let me ask you this question. You guys deal a lot in the factual science, but what about challenging big carbon, and what about challenging the politicians who receive support from big carbon? Does that need to be a bigger part of our coverage of this issue?
Yes, I mean, absolutely it does. So, I mean, I will see tweets from other, fact checkers and organizations that show how much money different politicians get from the fossil fuel industry and how their votes go. And there's a correlation. Who would have thunk it? Right? I mean, it's a pretty clear correlation as to what the votes are going to be based on. So I share all that type of information, at least on my social media feeds. Obviously, when I'm on TV, I mean, I've got 2.5 to 3 minutes to give you a weather forecast. And if I'm asked to talk about meteor showers, I'll do so. And if these climate change things I do, I'm not being asked to do it. I just do it without permission, and I just kind of get on air and do it. But on social media, that's where you see me challenging those type of scenarios, definitely. You guys probably do too.
Yeah, Jessica, what do you think? Do we need to call out Big Carbon? Do we need to call out the elected officials who are getting donations from Big Carbon?
I think the cool thing about living in Florida is our public records laws. We can look into those things, and really, to me, it's pointing those things out. I don't know, like calling out necessarily as, I guess it is calling out, but doing stories based on public records has been really revealing with those kinds of things. But yeah, that's basically all I have.
Yeah, you know, because we, in some cases, we have elected officials on both sides of the aisle who have received campaign donations from Big Carbon. Craig, what do you think?
I think it's helpful to do that. I'm going to talk this out while I'm thinking about it, so I'm probably going to stumble a bit. I think in Florida, you have not seen as much direct correlation amongst, say, state politicians of donations from Big Carbon to their political positions on this issue as you would on the federal level. I think on the state level, it's been more a matter of political orthodoxy, that people are walking in lockstep with what they think their party wants, as opposed to, say, an issue like sugar, where sugar gives them money and they take pro-sugar positions. But the interesting thing is that seems to be changing. The fact that Governor DeSantis is more open to dealing with climate change, I think, is opening the door for some other people to break away from that political orthodoxy. For instance, Matt Gaetz, maybe the most pro-Trump politician in Florida, has unveiled his version of a Green New Deal and has actually said, I think climate change is real and I think we need to do something about it. So if Matt Gaetz can make a change like that, I think there's a chance for anybody else who's locked in that, oh, I have to think this way because that's the way everybody else thinks. I think there's a chance for everybody to break away and make those kind of changes. And I think it would be good, I think it's good to highlight that in our coverage whenever we can as well. And not just necessarily, the guy wearing galoshes to Tallahassee every day. I mean, that's cute, but what are you doing about it? You know?
Do you think the media is doing enough on this issue?
Yes and no. On the one hand, obviously, we could be doing stories every single day on this issue because things are happening all over the place. And there are ramifications. For instance, you mentioned about the health issue that I don't think we're covering nearly enough. On the other hand, you run the risk of reader fatigue, that they'll think, oh, geez, here's another one of those stories about climate change. Let me flip over to the sports page. No offense. And so I think you have to pick your shots. You have to find the ones that have the most potential impact and go after those and write those stories. And the ones that I think will resonate the best are the ones that you need to be covering.
What do you think, John? Are we doing enough?
No. There aren't enough, first and foremost, just people that would emulate what I do or what Jim Gandy does in Columbia, South Carolina, or Elisa Rafa in Springfield, Missouri. I mean, there's many of us that are doing this, just simply communicating climate on a routine basis, but there aren't enough. Sometimes broadcast meteorologists are, early career professionals in markets where they fear that there will be a pushback, or where they fear that their news director wants, which generally is the case, absolutely no controversies, and so you're not going to talk about that because if you're going to alienate even 5% of our audience, I don't want you talking about it. And so it becomes very challenging and very difficult for people in newsrooms to be able to discuss this on the air or in print or in non-traditional media. I would also mention that at the national level, there are ebbs and flows in terms of coverage of climate change. But goodness me, I mean, we're more in an ebb than a flow lately. And I mean, I am very cognizant of the fatigue issue, and you know how it is. Any extreme weather event happens, and I don't know, let's call it the evangelizer's branch of climate change science is out there telling you, look, see what happened? This is climate change too. Whoa, let's wait for an attribution study. Let's not bombard people with things. So I'm very cognizant about that. I'm careful as to what I tweet and post, so that to not have people become fatigued. But as far as national coverage, I think print media is doing great, but I think broadcast media not so much. And they're, folks, this is one of the, if not the biggest challenge of the 21st century for mankind. And I mean, I know there's a lot of pressing issues, and it's difficult to look 50 years down the road as to what is going to occur. But because we're not acting, and because there's not enough attention to put to it, or because we put it off for 8 years because the words climate change couldn't be uttered in this state, that's 8 years too many, 8 months too many.
Can I add one thing?
I was going to say, hopefully nobody saw me roll my eyes when he said we couldn't talk about it for 8 years, but I did.
One of the other problems with saying, yes, we need to do more coverage of climate change is that because it's such a complex issue, you can't just go in and write about it in one day, generally. It's going to take some time to do digging, to do the reporting work, to do the shoe leather of going out and talking to people or reading and understanding the scientific reports and so forth. I'm working right now on a long-term story about climate change and its impact on Florida. It's going to be a 2-story package. And while I'm doing that, things are happening in the legislature that I'm having to not cover. So you end up with that balancing act of which environmental issues do I ignore or postpone writing about while I'm working on this story. So that becomes another limiting factor of, why aren't we writing more about climate change? And the funny thing is, I've got editors who want more climate change coverage, but also they say, oh, but before you finish that story, can you come over and do this one on the wildfires and the panhandle, and can you also do this and this and this and this?
Yeah.
So.
Well, to jump off, sorry, real quick,
go
just
ahead.
to jump off of what Craig was saying, in terms of more, I think that the people who do cover it right now are just so passionate about it and just like completely immersed in it. There could always be, as more of that, but it's just, it takes, I think there's a certain kind of person who loves covering this kind of thing, and really getting to know scientists. And there's so many interviews that can be done that don't even make it on the air, don't even make it on paper or online, just to kind of get the background information. And so I just think that there could always be more, but the people who are covering it right now are doing a really great job.
Yeah, so speaking of more, and Craig, you kind of alluded to this, as you can see, I'm a Metro columnist, but I'm also an assistant sports editor. There's a reason for that. We're having some manpower challenges at the Tampa Bay Times, and most media outlets are having manpower challenges, and most people who are still at the paper are doing at least 2 jobs. So when we talk about having a collaborative effort between different media outlets, is that the solution to getting more coverage on this? David had the breaking news. Do you think that's going to work as we try to put this together, Jessica?
So one really cool thing about public radio in Florida is that all the public radio stations work together. Jacksonville, Miami, Orlando. I'm sure I'm not naming Fort Myers, where I was from before. We all work together. We have this network online where every time one of us does a story, we post it online and share. So even if there's somebody who's in my station who can't cover a certain issue, Amy Green in Orlando is covering something in the environment, and we have Steve Newborn here and myself. And Miami is doing a great job as well. So in terms of collaboration, we have our own internal collaboration, which allows us to cover what are the highlights, what are the environmental issues, the pressing issues going around in the state right now. So and we also just launched recently, started airing the Florida Roundup, which airs or is airing, I'm not sure what time it is, today at noon. And so we get a chance, we have that chance to get on a statewide show to talk about environmental issues. And so in terms of collaboration for NPR, in Florida, I think we're on top of that, at least in that sense.
What do you think, John? We know of the compact in South Florida,
Right.
the working relationship.
Award-winning, by the way. I just saw an announcement that they just won an
Congratulations.
award. Well, I've contributed to it once, but I'm not part of that consortium. But it definitely is going to be a part of the future. You know, I'm kind of glad I'm close to retirement age in the sense that you know, broadcast news is in decline. You know, the fragmentation of the audience with, you know, 500 or 1,000 channels available for everyone, plus, you know, these. You know, you ever think of this? This was only invented about a dozen years ago. Mine's all messed up. But what a historical invention this has been, and what a game changer for the. And by the way, I mean, people in sub-Saharan Africa have smartphones too, okay? And they have apps too. And I mean, this has been the invention of the smartphone, one of the biggest inventions there's ever been. Anyway, we have this as competition. We have desktops as competition. Podcasts. I mean, it's a bombardment of media that is going to lead to, I believe, consolidation of newsrooms. You know, chances are a decade or two from now, yeah, you might still have ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox, but it's probable that those 4 newscasts, local newscasts, are probably going to be produced in maybe 2 newsrooms as they start to consolidate and, yes, you know, lay off people and so on and so forth. Our ratings are diminishing on a daily basis for every station. It's not just my station, by tens of thousands annually. So there's going to have to be a change, and there's going to have to be more collaboration to be able to get the stories out there. Obviously, there's new forms of getting information out there, and you know, we're all overloaded with information, but the way we get it is changing, and I think those collaborative efforts are going to continue.
Finally, and then we'll open up to the audience. I just want to ask you guys, we touched on this earlier, but how do you go about dealing with those lofty issues? Jessica, you mentioned something that'll be that could happen in 2099. I'm proud to say that I will be 135 in 2099. and good Lord willing, I'll still be here. But
And still writing that column.
you know, but sometimes when I hear those things, I think, well, you know, yes, I want the planet to be better for my grandchildren, but I'm out. Like it's just hard for me to look that far down the road. How do you deal with those lofty issues? How do you deal with the science and relating it to your audience?
Well, you know, for me, I mean, I look at my nieces and nephews. I mean, my entire family is from Florida. My family lives in Miami, actually. And I look at my nieces and nephews, and I'm talking to my siblings, and they keep purchasing homes in the tip of South Florida. And I'm just like, and for me, I kind of, because I'm so immersed in it, I kind of see the big picture, and I'm concerned. You know, I'm concerned for, you know, they think that they're going to be able to pass these homes down for generations. And I don't know. I guess it's just a matter of willingness to think outside of what is happening right now. Right now, we do have these issues of it's heating up, like we talked about, the health issues and the prolonged allergies and things like that, and people being angry. You know, those are kind of immediate issues. But I think that it's just about perspective, and I think that it is important to open our minds to think about something further than today or tomorrow. So.
Yeah. What do you think?
So, I mean, the thing about this is that it's nonlinear, right? I mean, you saw the charts on the projections on sea level rise. So, I mean, it kind of looks linear the way it's changed over the last 100 years, but the next 30 years might have as much change as we had in 100 years, and then 10 years after that, you'll have as much change as you would normally have in 50 years. So this is all accelerating. And let me tell you, it's RCP 8.5 until anybody tells us otherwise. It is, I mean, we are on the higher of those lines in terms of the emissions that we're injecting into the atmosphere. We just had a record year in terms of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere and burning coal and so on and so forth. So it's not changing anytime soon. And what's happening is, in this age of accelerations, we are seeing more of these extreme weather events, which is making people much more aware of the threat. So I don't think 2019 is the same as 2009 in terms of, how do we bridge that challenge of human nature not being able to comprehend a threat that is so far down the road, because the threat is becoming much more real in the present day and age as things continue to accelerate in a non-linear way. So yes, stronger hurricanes, storm surges on a background of a higher sea level, so the storm surge is reaching places where it didn't reach before. Those sunny day floods, happening 50 times a year instead of 5 times a year. And it's funny because I sometimes in presentations I use a timeline that I come up with in terms of this sea level rise issue and the sunny day floods issue. And the first word is novelty. Think of the octopus that came up through the drain into the parking garage in Miami Beach. That picture went viral. Everybody saw that a couple of years back when it happened. So it's kind of a novelty at first. And then it becomes a nuisance. Well, it was kind of cute at first, but man, this is so, I can't get to my house because it's flooded, or the tourist gets to Miami and he can't get to the hotel because he has to wade through dirty Biscayne Bay water to be able to get to his hotel. And then from after novelty and nuisance, then it becomes a pocketbook issue. Why is my insurance going up so much? Why is the National Flood Insurance Program in bankruptcy, right? Why do we continue to subsidize rich folks who are building out the coast, right? And then from pocketbook, it becomes a lifestyle issue. Man, I give up. I'm not going to live here anymore. And then it becomes an existential issue. Retreat, right? We have to leave those areas along the coast that are threatened by sea level rise. And all these things are happening slowly at first. They're starting to accelerate, and I think that's what is helping us now see how Americans' views on global warming or climate change and whether it's caused by humans, those views are changing. This is no longer a country where there's half the people that think it's not happening and are dismissive, and the other half is, oh my gosh, this is an issue. 70% of Americans see that climate change, or accept that climate change is real and that it's caused by humans. Not all of them see it as an immediate threat, and that's where you see maybe lower percentages. Is it an immediate threat to me and my family? Well, maybe you'll see 40 or 50% of the people say that. But as far as, disputing the science, those numbers are shrinking. And I think the realization that weird things are starting to happen is really helping us change.
When I write about it, I try to avoid the predictive part, other than to say scientists say it's going to get worse, because there's such a wide range of possibilities of how bad it's going to get. But instead, because I'm in Florida, I can say, look at what's already happened. Look at how it's already affecting things. Look at these various ways in which we're already dealing with climate change. I wouldn't have done this because it involved lying, but there's a great story on a website called Popula where a reporter, yeah, you know what I'm talking about, where a reporter went to, she pretended to be someone in the real estate market in Miami, interested in buying a waterfront property, and she recorded what all of the different real estate people told her when she asked them about rising sea level. And my favorite quote was from the one real estate person who said, "Don't worry, it's being thought about, it's being taken care of, it's not a problem, unless, of course, you're planning to stay here and have kids."
Exactly. Exactly. I need to read that quote. It's on Popula. I tweeted it out, I think, yesterday. And sometimes when I tweet stories out, what I do is I take an excerpt from the article, and I put it out there. I gotta find it. I gotta find it because here it is. So this is a realtor. I'm just going to use my voice because I think I'll insult people if I
No, use your realtor voice.
mimic how I would like for this to sound, but I'll just be monotone here. Everybody has done these like research, and they have these like I can't think of the word now, studies. And basically they said we shouldn't be concerned because it's being figured out and we shouldn't be concerned. So that's a realtor to a person, you know, pretending to be looking for real estate on Miami Beach.
And talking about immediate issues in terms of housing, one of the things that Lulu Garcia Navarro touched on in Miami is some of the poorer neighborhoods that are inland, like Liberty City and Little Haiti, their prices are going up and they're being priced out because that's where people want to go to purchase homes. It's cheaper and it's also more inland, and so that's an immediate, just to jump off that conversation about housing and immediate effects of climate change. And so we're already seeing the rise of cost in Florida going up, and it is a part of that. It's the gentrification of the high ground. And you're going to see a lot more of that. So those are things that are going on now that you can write about, and about land use decisions, always a hot topic in Florida. For instance, while Governor Scott was in office, Governor, I'm not a scientist, Scott, he and the cabinet voted to approve expanding and upgrading the nuclear plant at Turkey Point, which is on the water. And there was absolutely no discussion whatsoever about, gee, is that really the right place for a nuclear plant given that the sea levels are rising? Every day we have local governments in Florida approving new development in waterfront areas, in spite of the fact that those are already flood-prone areas, and they're going to be worse and worse as sea level rises and storm surges get worse. And there's never, ever any discussion of, hey, is this really a smart thing to do given the problems that we're facing? So I think those are ways to write about it and not to say it's happening now and not try to deal with, well, how much of the bad is it going to be later on? Well, it's already bad now. So just think about what it's going to be like in the future, All right.
Okay, we want to take some questions from the audience. Do I need to come down and be Phil Donahue, or do we have a microphone out there?
Do you guys remember Phil Donahue?
This young man right here with the microphone, he doesn't know who Phil Donahue is. Yeah, I didn't think so. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm not hearing that it's on. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'd like to hear from other voices of the media about the issue of global warming. What about the business community? Entrepreneur Paul Hawken did a research with a number of global scientists about solutions to global warming. His book is called Drawdown. And if you look at the top 25 solutions, those are things we can do here in Pinellas County. When I hear about sea level rise science, there's hard for me to get involved. What can I do about it? But there are entrepreneurs out here in Pinellas County who can step up and do something about food waste, one of the biggest. So that's what I'm curious about. How can we engage the business media people to talk about solutions rather than the woe is me, it's going down the drain?
Yeah, and we need to write more about that. I had the pleasure of talking to an engineer from Wade Trim that I wrote about last year. They went into South Beach and actually raised the ground level. Yeah. I mean, it was, I'm going to admit, I didn't fully get what she was talking about, but she said they made the ground higher, which was completely fascinating to me. So there are some solutions out there, and we need to write more about them and try to illuminate them.
Our business reporters do a great job of covering alternate energy sources, writing about the expansion of solar in Florida. We're the Sunshine State, why don't we have more solar? Well, now the big utilities are really getting into it. The cost is going down, and so now you're seeing a lot more solar. Not so much wind power in Florida. The one time we have really good winds is when we have hurricanes. So, but different. That's one of the ways they're approaching it. They're also writing about entrepreneurs who are getting into the business of trying to deal with it. Battery storage is another big story that they've done. And yes, there are government contracts available that we need to write about. For instance, the resiliency issue, where you're talking about raising the roads, trying to add more pumps and things like that to deal with the sunny day flooding problem in South Florida. Those are all government contracts, so there's a lot of money involved in trying to be resilient and trying to cope with what's going on, as opposed to outright solutions.
Sure.
You know, I want to mention in answer to your question, so I'm on the board of the Clio Institute, all right, in South Florida. And, you know, we're very aware that this woe is me, you know, this is terrible. There is some fatigue about that. And when we brought down Paul Hawken. And by the way, Drawdown it's more of an almanac kind of book. I mean, it's kind of tough to read through, but just as a reference, it's just fabulous. I did it via audiobook, and it helped me, you know, it helped my hard copy be more digestible. But when we present on climate now, we always like to have a session on solutions, because, you know, we have to get past, you know, this. Climate change is real, right? Everybody in this room, you know, certainly is aware of that. So we're no longer trying to establish that point. Now we need to get to the, you know, well, let's make it less severe. So if the train has left the station, let's keep the train from accelerating, even if it can't return to the station. And then let's adapt for what's going to happen. And adaptation is, and again, I mean, I highly recommend Drawdown. Just yesterday, it's funny because I had to use it as reference. I'm going through a master's program right now at Johns Hopkins on environmental science and policy, and I had to write about solutions, so I used Drawdown as a reference for climate change solutions. Yeah.
All right, we have a question right down here.
What can we do as members of the local news consumers to get support from our local broadcast meteorologists to do what you do in your region? I'm super grateful for all four of you being here and having this very important conversation. And we obviously have more bench strength in the print and the radio coverage of these issues, but we were unable to find any of our local weather folks to come. And so any tips you can give for ways we can help?
Yeah, this market is really challenging in that area. I know this because Clio is putting together the Empowering Capable Climate Communicators session, which is open to the public, by the way, in Miami on the 26th and 27th. But we have Michael Mann coming down, climate scientist out of Penn State. So it's a big deal. And we have a media breakout session. And we invited broadcast meteorologists from around the state, and nobody from Tampa is coming. You know, sometimes it has to do with the market you're in and the hue of the market, redder, bluer, purplish. And I think this is a challenging market to discuss that on TV. And I do this because I have empathy with them. All right, I do understand the position that they're in, but some of those folks are my age, you know. And I mean, this is a time like no other to be courageous. When has there ever been a time for us to show courage on these issues and so many other issues, right? So, you know, if I could talk to them, that's what I would say. Grow a pair.
Yeah. Hey, you, sir, in the back, and then, ma'am, we'll get to you next.
I'd like a comment from the panel on. We've talked about the demand side issue of reporting on climate change, but there's been a massive consolidation of ownership, both in print and broadcast media. How often do you think the ownership philosophy of these big consortiums of companies that own media, both print and broadcast, are affecting the ability of those people to report on it?
I think it depends on who's in charge. For instance, the Sinclair TV stations, they're not going to be telling you much about climate change. On the other hand, by the way, I have to throw in here, the Tampa Bay Times is not owned by any of these organizations. It's an independent thing owned by a journalism nonprofit. But Gatehouse Media is a really big player in the national newspaper industry, and all of the Gatehouse newspapers in Florida teamed up to do a series of climate change stories that ran in each one of their papers. So in that case, it actually made them stronger to tackle the issue. So I think it all depends on the politics of the people up top. And Gatehouse was interested in, hey, this is a good story, we should all go after it, versus Sinclair taking a political position of, this is going to embarrass people we support, therefore we're not going to talk about it.
Ma'am?
You were talking about solutions. I read a paper on wastewater and sewage bubbling CO2 emissions through wastewater and sewage management, and using minerals to solidify. Basically, there's a precipitate that's produced, and it binds with the CO2. They used it in New York, and it's proven to work. Do you know if there's anyone in Florida doing that?
I am not aware of anybody in Florida doing that. Carbon sequestration needs to be a part of the solutions going forward, and that sounds like one potential solution. There's a lot of research going into that, by the way. What's really interesting? Let me tell you about carbon sequestration very briefly. 3 or 4 years ago, no, it was more, maybe a half dozen years ago, I'm at this International Weather and Climate Forum in Paris, and they bring somebody from Shell to talk to us. Boy, that's odd. Here we are at this climate conference, and here's this fossil fuel company. They're going to talk to us. And what they talked to us about was carbon sequestration, because that was their vision. We want to keep extracting oil, but let's remove the carbon from the atmosphere. Now it turns out, if you look at what Shell is doing lately in terms of environmental responsibility and such, they seem to be moving in the right direction. I've seen some news traffic on that just in the past week. But given where we are, given where our CO2 concentrations are and where they're headed, this needs to be a part of the solutions. Yeah.
Sir, here in the back, as we try to rush and get me more questions.
I've been trying to explain science to the public all my career. I'm a scientist, and it's discouraging for sure. I've even given written and given oral testimony before a House subcommittee in Washington. And it's just discouraging to try to educate the public. I mean, you're preaching to the choir, and that's fine, but the people that don't believe it aren't willing to learn. That's my frustration. So I'm at the point where I'm thinking just going back to basics and to explain the science, and which I'd like to see more of in the media. Explain exactly how the greenhouse effect works. Just don't say it's the greenhouse effect. How does the greenhouse effect actually work? When you talk about the polar vortex, how does that work? What causes the polar vortex? How does El Nino work? What causes El Nino? What's behind it, to the point at the level where people can understand it? How does a low pressure system form off West Africa and ultimately become a hurricane? Let's explain the science behind that in ways that people can understand. So I guess I'm promoting small scientific vignettes, either in the paper or on television, where you just take a break for 30 seconds or 45 seconds or a minute and say, okay, this is how the greenhouse effect works when infrared encounters a CO2 molecule. What goes on? How is that energy being trapped?
So I'm with you. I would love that. I would love to have a half-an-hour show on science every week, if I could. I mean, my two anchors, each one has one has a political type of half-hour show. The other one has a local community issues type of show. But there's no science show. And we've got a big challenge in this country in terms of scientific literacy, which is dwindling. If you've read Tom Nichols' The Death of Expertise, another book I highly recommend, or for that matter, if you want to go old school and go to one of my heroes, Carl Sagan's The Demon Haunted World, who in 25 years ago basically forecasted where we'd be today. in terms of what people believe and, of scientific facts versus pseudoscience versus just pure lies.
Yeah, and I don't want to make light of the issue, but sometimes you have to use analogies that people like me, sports guy, can understand. And my friend Susan Glickman, who is a lobbyist in Tallahassee for the Southern Clean Energy Alliance, we were talking about it, and she said to me, she said, "Hey, Ernest, you know how they say what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas?" I was like, "Yeah, oh yeah, I get that." She says, "Well, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It affects the whole world." And see, and then I could understand. You see, and you got it. We need a marketing effort. We need to, what you said about CO2 and all of that, we got to take that. I've learned more about science watching The Big Bang Theory than I've ever known in my life. And it's funny, but it's serious. You want people to understand this? You're going to have to find some ways to break it down. It's like a steak. You got to cut it up into pieces. What do they say? The best way to eat an elephant?
A bite at a time.
A bite at a time. We got to understand it that way.
Yeah, in public radio we say, "Tell me like I'm a fifth grader. Pretend I'm a fifth grader and tell me
Yes,
that way." But I was on a panel once a few years ago to talk to people who are in the science community about how do we send a press release, and how do you get the attention? How do you speak to the general public? And I also went to an ocean acidification conference in Southwest Florida a few years ago as well, and I heard the same thing that you were talking about. And just like these people or these scientists are so passionate, but also disheartened because, and this one guy was talking about how he's just trying to discuss something with somebody and their eyes glaze over. When you start talking about something you're so passionate about, it's your whole life. And so I was really moved by that. And so I brought them in. I brought in a few scientists to do a half-hour show, live call-in talk show on ocean acidification for WGCU in Fort Myers. And, so in public radio, luckily, we do have the room to do that because whatever we want to talk about, whatever we think is something that people don't quite understand, we can expand on that in a lot of ways, whether it's a short spot story, a long feature story, or we want to do a half-hour talk show where people can call in and ask questions.
Sir, you had a question right here.
Yes, first of all.
And we got time for about 2 more questions. Let's
compliment everybody who's here. So my comments are going to be on the news media in general. Agreeing that science is the best arbiter of reality, and we've got issues dealing with opinion versus fact out there, and people thinking one's different than the other. The media, I think, has that important role as a liaison between science, which has an issue communicating to the public. And I'm concerned as I read many articles on climate change, the number of times I've seen a 2 degrees C rise in parentheses showing 34 degrees F, which is a temperature of 2 degrees C. It's not the rise. It's very frustrating that the science savvy, the competency of the media in general, not anyone here, is lacking. You mentioned the frustration about this always being here, and it's not news. Nothing's changed, except every day it does change. There's a associated cost with realized impacts, and there's also the net present value of future impacts. Every day you could run a ticker on what's going on as far as costs go. I just don't see anybody. I'm yearning for somebody in the media who's going to sit there and say, here's an approach we can do systematically. We can take a look at it and do series. You talk about people not understanding basic science. Primers all the time on this, that, and the other, running regularly. Who's out there doing that? Who's dealing with psychology of people? You talk about science and law and politics. I thought that was great insights. But the psychology of people and what they believe and they don't. Who is going to be out there? The Poynter Institute is one, but is there anybody else?
Well, yeah, I think it's a challenge that all of these different institutions have to address, not just the media, but science also. We have to meet at that intersection and come up with ways to help people understand it. All right, 2 more questions. Well, there's like 5 hands up. Ma'am in the back, yes, you. What's your question?
I would like to see more of information so that each one of us here who have made perhaps some small sacrifice or a bigger sacrifice to be here today who are interested can speak to our fellow humans and say, this is what you can do to make a change. I think a lot of the talk makes us think that someone else is going to do it. But we are the people that are going to not pick up that straw with our soda. We are the people who are going to take a brush and with a silicone straw and clean it out, be responsible for ourselves. And I'd like to see some marketing as far as that goes too, where we get some more personal responsibility.
But ma'am, we have done those stories. Here's the problem, is it's not connecting. We've done stories saying fossil fuels are the problem. So the solution is don't use them as much. Find ways to avoid it. Find ways to not use the things that are causing the greenhouse effect. Use alternative energy sources, use more efficient light bulbs. All of those things, we know those things. And it's hard to tell people something different because they're still going to make lifestyle choices that are based on convenience and price more than they will based on what's good for the future. And that's especially true in Florida, where our whole lifestyle is YOLO. You know, you only live once, let's go for the gusto, let's drive over to Disney World and spend the day burning fossil fuels there and have a good time. And that's the basis of our whole economy, is getting people here and having them drive around, and we're adding more and more roads instead of mass transit. And those are things where we know how to fix this. We know how to try to deal with it. We just don't want to.
If only the federal government had been willing to give us funding for a bullet train from Orlando to Tampa, things would be so different. All right, listen, we're out of time, obviously. How about a round of applause for our panelists? Thank you so much for being here. I think I speak for all of them when I say we realize there's a lot of issues that we need to address, and we're going to make every effort to try to illuminate what's happening with climate change and get people to care about it.
Right as soon as we hire all those extra reporters.
I know, I know. All right, that's all I'm saying. Thank you.
Good presentation. All right, great, thanks. And how about a round of applause for our moderator, who did a superb job. And ma'am, for that last question about what we citizens can do, come back tomorrow. The second session of the morning will give concrete tips and advice and information about how you can do it and what you can do.
You don't need her to come back. You need us to come back.
Well, I want everybody to, of course, of course.
I won't be here.
Well, I've been encouraged to hear what I heard today about the media and the fact that they are on it and they are engaged and concerned, as we all are. So thank you, media. And now, how about some lunch? The caterer, Nature's Table, has several choices in the back, and for those who ordered a vegetarian or a special lunch, they're on my right, your left, on the far wall in the back. Please grab one and return to your seat as quickly as possible, because we're going to continue the program during lunch with our speaker. And while you're don't leave yet, while you're getting your lunch and sitting down and starting to eat, I have two questions to put before you to think about in anticipation of the luncheon speaker. Read the program description of him and his expertise, and then think, given the unique vulnerabilities in Tampa Bay, what anticipatory actions can establish us as a leader in the blue-green economy, and what assets will our various sectors need to develop for leverage in the coming $30 trillion investment that is replacing petroleum-based industry and economy. Thank you. Let's grab some lunch and get back to our seats as quickly as we can.